Before the bloodshed, before the horrors unfolded in the dead of night, Lari was already a land steeped in fear. The tension in the air was thick, an invisible pressure that weighed on every soul who called this place home. The 1950s marked one of the most violent periods in Kenya's history. By 1952, the Mau Mau rebellion had escalated into a full-scale guerrilla war against British colonial rule. The movement, made up primarily of the Kikuyu people, sought to reclaim lands seized by British settlers. By 1950, British settlers controlled over 7.5 million acres of Kenya's most fertile land, while millions of Kikuyu were pushed into native reserves, covering less than 2 million acres. But the colonial government labeled them as terrorists and imposed a brutal crackdown. Lari, a settlement in the central province, became a flashpoint of the struggle. The Mau Mau fighters, estimated to be around 20,000 strong at their peak, operated from the dense forests, launching night raids against British troops and their allies. The British, in turn, relied on loyalist Kikuyu, who were recruited into the Home Guard, a colonial militia that grew to over 25,000 members. These loyalists, many of whom were former neighbors of the Mau Mau, patrolled villages, reported rebel activity, and enforced colonial rule. By 1955, at least 90% of Kikuyu men between the ages of 18 and 40 had been forced to take an oath of allegiance, either to the Mau Mau or the British Home Guard. The division was deadly. Between 1952 and 1956, over 1,800 loyalists were killed by the Mau Mau, while British security forces executed thousands of suspected rebels. During the same period, the Home Guard was responsible for an estimated 5,000 extrajudicial killings of suspected Mau Mau sympathizers. Tension in Lari had reached a boiling point, and the village, strategically located near key colonial outposts, was considered an enemy stronghold by the Mau Mau. Then came March 25, 1953, the night that would forever be burned into history. It began with an unnatural silence. Just past midnight on March 26, 1953, an estimated 300 to 500 Mau Mau fighters descended upon Lari. They moved like shadows, their bodies smeared with dirt for camouflage. Their weapons were crude but effective: machetes, pangas, and a few stolen firearms. The first attack came swiftly. Doors were kicked open, and within minutes, flames engulfed homes. Screams erupted as terrified villagers woke to chaos. The Mau Mau struck with precision, targeting the houses of known loyalists. Within an hour, at least 120 homes had been burned to the ground, leaving hundreds without shelter before dawn. Some men tried to fight back, but most were dragged from their homes before they could react. At least 50 of the men killed that night were bound with sisal ropes before being executed. At least 74 people, including women and children, were hacked to death. Many were forced to kneel before being executed. Some were tortured, their bodies mutilated as a warning to others. Infants were thrown into burning huts. The youngest victim was reportedly just 2 months old. Survivors recalled the horror of watching family members butchered before their eyes. One witness, who was 12 years old at the time, later described the night as a vision of hell, where the air was thick with smoke and the ground was wet with blood. The attack lasted less than 2 hours, but by the time the Mau Mau disappeared back into the forests, Lari was unrecognizable. Homes had been reduced to smoldering ash. Bodies littered the village. The survivors, those who had managed to hide in the bushes or play dead beneath corpses, were left in stunned silence. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. The massacre had ended, but the real nightmare was just beginning. At dawn, British forces arrived to a scene of unspeakable carnage. The massacre at Lari quickly became one of the most infamous Mau Mau attacks of the entire rebellion. But the colonial response was swift and even more brutal. Within 24 hours, British soldiers and loyalist militias launched a full-scale retaliation. In a series of raids across the surrounding villages, over 400 Mau Mau suspects were rounded up. Many were summarily executed. Others were taken to internment camps, where they faced forced labor, torture, and starvation. Between 1952 and 1960, the British colonial government detained over 1.5 million Kikuyu people, nearly a third of the entire Kikuyu population, inside concentration-style camps and fortified villages. In 1954 alone, Nairobi saw over 25,000 Kikuyu men forcibly removed from their homes, interrogated, and either executed, imprisoned, or sent to labor camps in what was known as Operation Anvil, a mass purge designed to crush any remaining Mau Mau support. During the height of the Mau Mau War, British forces conducted at least 1,190 hangings of captured suspects, one of the largest state-sanctioned execution campaigns of the 20th century outside of World War II. To put this into perspective, Nazi Germany executed 1,324 people for resistance activities in occupied France, only slightly more than the British did in Kenya. At least 50,000 detainees died inside these camps due to starvation, torture, and disease, numbers that were deliberately underreported by colonial authorities. Meanwhile, Lari itself became a propaganda tool. British newspapers plastered photos of the massacre across the front pages, using the event to justify harsher crackdowns. The narrative was simple. The Mau Mau were savages, and their actions proved that colonial rule was necessary to maintain order. But the truth was far more complex. Some survivors later claimed that British intelligence had prior knowledge of an impending Mau Mau attack, but had failed to intervene, possibly to let the massacre happen as an excuse for a broader military response. Others whispered that certain loyalist leaders had been deliberately left unprotected to provoke an outcry. What was clear, however, was that no one truly won. By the time the war ended in 1956, an estimated 11,000 Mau Mau fighters had been killed, along with 2,000 African loyalists and 32 British soldiers. But the numbers told only part of the story. The scars of Lari, both physical and psychological, ran far deeper. And decades later, haunting questions remained. Did the British manipulate the events for political gain? How many more atrocities were buried beneath the weight of history? The dead do not speak, but their stories remain, etched into the memories of those who survived, hidden in the cracks of history, waiting for someone to listen. For decades, Lari has been remembered as a symbol of horror. But beneath the official accounts lies something far more chilling. A war waged in the shadows where truth was the first casualty. The few who lived through that night carried more than just scars. They carried the weight of knowing. Some could not bear it. Many survivors chose silence, refusing to recount what they saw, even to their own children. Some vanished mysteriously in the years that followed, victims of retribution, secrets too dangerous to keep. A handful tried to speak out, only to be ignored, ridiculed, or conveniently forgotten by history. One such voice was Njeri Wambui, who was 12 years old when the massacre happened. She lived to be an old woman, but before she died, she whispered a chilling confession to her grandson. "They lied to you about what happened that night. They lied to all of us. The Mau Mau came, yes, but the worst came after." History books tell you that the massacre at Lari ended when the Mau Mau disappeared into the forest. But the true nightmare began when the British arrived. Survivors who had managed to hide from the Mau Mau found themselves rounded up by British soldiers. Some were accused of being rebels, even though they had just escaped a rebel massacre. Others were taken away in trucks, never to be seen again. One British officer, whose report was later classified for decades, described what they did in the days following the attack. "We made examples of them. We did what was necessary to ensure control." The British did not just retaliate against the Mau Mau. They wiped out the loose ends, those who saw too much, those who could tell the wrong version of events, those who would not fit into the clean, controlled history that the colonial government wanted the world to see. Despite years of advocacy, British colonial files related to the Lari Massacre and its aftermath remain classified under the Migrated Archives, a secret collection of over 240,000 documents deliberately hidden from public access for decades. Officially, the Mau Mau uprising resulted in 11,503 recorded deaths, but some historians estimate that the true number of African casualties, both fighters and civilians, may have exceeded 90,000 due to executions, starvation, and disease in detention camps. The fire may have gone out in Lari, but the real silence, the one built on fear, lasted for generations. 70 years have passed. The trees have grown where bodies once lay. The earth has swallowed the blood. The ruins of that night have been rebuilt, But some things refuse to stay buried. In 2013, after decades of silence, the British government finally admitted to war crimes during the Mau Mau Rebellion. 5,228 Kenyan survivors of British brutality were awarded compensation. Each survivor received an average of just £3,800 in compensation, barely enough to cover the medical costs of the injuries they endured. But the victims of Lari? Most were ignored. To this day, documents related to the massacre remain missing. Files that should exist in British archives are either classified or lost. But what is missing tells its own story. Why were intelligence reports about an impending attack ignored? Why were entire families removed from Lari before the attack, but not told to warn others? Why were so many bodies never recovered, despite official lists of the dead? To this day, at least 6,000 official British military files on the Mau Mau uprising remain classified, locked away in secret archives. Today, Lari is more than just a place. It is a wound that Kenya has never fully healed from. It was a tragedy that divided an entire people. It was a battlefield where no one won. It was a ghost story whispered across generations. But more than anything, Lari is a warning. History repeats itself, not because we forget, but because we are taught the wrong lessons. And sometimes the most terrifying truths are the ones we were never meant to know. And the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to rise. Will you listen? Thank you watching. History is full of untold horrors, buried secrets, and chilling conspiracies. At Freak Files, we uncover what they don't want you to know. Subscribe now because the truth is always stranger than fiction. And remember, history isn't just written by the victors. It's edited, erased, and rewritten